My name is Allan Nairn. I'm a freelance journalist. This is my third trip to Guatemala. I recently published an article on Guatemala in the New York Times, and this time we'll be doing a few short news articles and probably a longer magazine piece about Guatemala. And this is Jean Marie Simon, a photographer.
I'm a photographer, and I'm based in New York, and this is my third trip to Guatemala. The first time I was here on assignment for Geo magazine in 1980, and this past year I was here for Time magazine.
In March, a new government took power here in Guatemala, led by General Efrain Rios Montt. And the Rios Montt government has received a great deal of publicity around the world. And he claims to be reforming some of the corruption in Guatemalan politics and has adopted a new military strategy, which is more subtle than that of the previous government. And because of this change in power, the United States government is now considering giving military aid to Guatemala in the form of helicopters, which are very crucial to the guerrilla war going on here. So this is a very important time to be in Guatemala to assess the situation. And we recently discussed these matters in Washington with people who have been following the Guatemala issue for a number of years. Could you start by giving us your assessment of the current human rights situation in Guatemala and how it may have changed in recent months?
Well, I think the important factor is that there has been, over the last 6 months, evidence of significant improvement in the human rights situation in Guatemala. Since the coming into power of the Rios Montt government, the level of violence in the country, politically inspired violence, particularly in the urban areas, has declined rather dramatically. That being said, however, I think it's important also to note that the level of violence in the countryside continues at a level which is of concern to all. And while it is difficult, if not impossible, to attribute responsibility for that violence in each instance, it is clear that in the countryside, the government does indeed need to make further progress in terms of improving its control over government troops.
Bill, what's going on right now in Guatemala?
Well, we have reason to think that there have been thousands of people massacred since the government of President Rios Montt came to power in March of '82.
Do you know what the level of killings has been since the coup?
It's been sickening, disheartening, and phenomenal. It has not slackened any since he took over the government, and we're getting reports continuously coming in about massacres in all parts of the country.
About how many people have been killed since the coup?
We have information on over 2,000 people who have been killed, and we continue to receive reports from unionists, from church people, from refugees who've managed to get out of the country, from eyewitnesses to incidences in various villages. They're coming in all the time.
And who's responsible for most of the killings?
All the information that we have to date is that that the security forces of Guatemala are responsible for the massacres.
Precisely what is the U.S. military presence or role in Guatemala at the moment?
We have no military presence or role. We have, as a part of our diplomatic establishment, a defense attaché office and a military representative. But that is the same sort of representation that we have in virtually all other countries in the world. We do not have American trainers working with the Guatemalan Army. We do not have American military personnel active in Guatemala in that sort of area.
There are no American trainers there?
No.
None performing the types of functions that go on in El Salvador?
No, there are not.
Mm-hmm. So do you think it's worth her going to Quiche?
I don't know, because I don't know how much time we're going to be able to spend up there and whether we're going to be able to get anything that's worthwhile.
It might be interesting just to see how the Army is controlling the situation.
Do you think they're going to let us talk to the people who live in the town, though? Because you know the Army's going to give us one story, and the people who live in the town are just...
even a controlled story from someone who has a lieutenant looking over his shoulder can be interesting. You see how they tell it, see what version they give. Guatemala is one of the most unequal countries in the world. There's a small oligarchy consisting of less than 1% of the population that is very wealthy. Many of them are millionaires from their exports of coffee and cotton and sugar. But the vast majority of the population is very, very poor. And a guerrilla movement has grown up here, which is now quite strong and is threatening to overthrow the government. And now it has reached the point where there's a very intense war going on between the army and the guerrillas, which seem to have popular support in a number of parts of the country, especially the northwest, Pidió, which is the area we're thinking about going to right now.
You've been doing a health survey here in Epidem. What is the situation with the health and the nutrition level of people here?
Well, nutrition is a main problem here. Malnutrition, 80% of the population probably is malnourished to some extent.
80% malnutrition.
That's a rough estimate. I have no idea, but from what I've seen in the last 5 days.
Have some people been dying of hunger?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, a lot of people are dying of hunger.
Can you give some idea what?
And secondary effects of that? No, it's hard to pin that down.
But a good number of people.
Yeah, and effects of malnutrition. All the infectious diseases, measles kills here.
Mm-hmm.
TB is killing. TB is rampant. It's endemic here.
What is the level of tuberculosis?
I would say probably 60% of the population.
60%.
I don't know from what I've seen.
And how can people work when they're so malnourished and there's such a level of disease?
Because it's their lifestyle. They're used to living with disease and a high infant mortality rate. That therefore they have a lot of children. And to them, work is of most importance. It's their pride.
But physically, how can they do it?
It's the magnificence of the human endurance. It's you'll see the people working out. I see a man with a collapsed lung from TB.
Mm-hmm.
That's still carrying 40-pound ricks of wood,
mm-hmm.
14 kilometers on his back. How can you do it? Well, I don't know. I couldn't do it by myself.
En vista de la situación esta que se está presentando, mueva el personal de aquí de Mono con 3 patrullas, por lo menos de 80 hombres, y hace cerco sobre las poblaciones o sobre los objetivos 1, 2 y 3. Vamos a hacer un cerco alrededor, ya que usted tiene una patrulla en contacto y esta otra también. Vamos a pedir refuerzos de mirlo para que bajen. Y vamos a pedir refuerzos de zorro para que también hagan un cerco y evitar que se enmontañen todos los heridos que tiene ahorita. ¿Cuántos tiene?
43.
Sí, en realidad lo que está haciendo la guerrilla es aplicando terror. Terror sobre las aldeas que han comprendido que están trabajando por una causa innoble, inhumana, y entonces se han pegado, han buscado la protección del ejército, y entonces la guerrilla se ha quedado sin abastecimiento en el lugar. Entonces tratan de aplicar terror para obligarlos a ayuda. Aquí tenemos 98, se está armando esa casa que está ahí para meter a 98 refugiados desplazados de esa aldea.
Y los culpables de esto y la mentalidad que les dieron fueron los curas. La mayoría de curas vinieron a mentir aquí. Y los señores de los catecistas y los no sé quiénes son los otros señores de la voz de Cristo, sí, de los del cooperativismo y un montón de cosas que vinieron a mentir aquí a la gente. Vinieron a reunir a la gente, pero con otra mentalidad. Cuando la gente se dio cuenta que eran mentiras, ya no los ayudaron, entonces la guerrilla tuvo que ir a la montaña. Y en la montaña no tienen que comer.
Los sacaron, que los repartieron, unos para un cuarto, otros para otro, unos que iban para la gloria, otros que iban para el infierno. Los amarraron, los golpearon en diferentes partes del cuerpo, en el patio de la iglesia. Después preguntaron si los fusilaban ahí o los llevaban al cementerio, y la gente que no iba a ser fusilada dijo que al cementerio. Los llevaron y me dijeron que yo apuntara a la gente. Yo apunté los nombres y eran como 105 los que quedaron. Y buscaron asadones, fueron a hacer un foso como de unos 5 metros, más o menos, de aquí para allá. Unos 5 metros de largo por unos 3,5 de ancho. Y los pusieron, los ponían a la orilla del foso y les pegaban un balazo en la frente. Y nosotros, toda la gente estaba ahí mirando como unos 10 o 12 metros.
¿Y cuántos murieron?
Murieron 24.
¿Y quién eran la gente armada?
Eran soldados.
¿Cómo sabe que eran soldados?
Porque después ellos dijeron que eran del ejército y que ellos estaban ejecutando la ley de Ríos Montt.
Ella calcula que tendrían unos 12 años. La sacaron, pero cuando ella comprendió y vio que ya se había quitado de la puerta y que se habían llevado a las chicas, entonces ella huyó, pero ya había entrado la noche. Huyó y se fue a meter entre el monte, pero la oyeron y le dispararon. Y ella se tiró y se fue rodando en el barranco y ahí pasó la noche. Ella oyó, dice, ametralladoras y oyó muchos disparos. Y ahí pasó la noche ella angustiada y golpeada. Y cuando caminó, cuando fue a buscar a la vivienda donde estaba su mamá, estaban todos, los habían quemado. Entonces la vivienda estaba incendiada y la gente también. Y ella empezó a ver cadáveres carbonizados. Encontró a su mamá y su mamá solo tenía la mitad del cuerpo quemada, pero estaba muerta y nada más así, acostada con las manos juntas. Y entonces oyó una voz de una anciana que le decía: no seas ingrata, matame de una vez. Y entonces pasó por la casa donde ella había estado y solo encontró a todas las jóvenes que estaban regadas por el monte, por el camino, por ahí, alrededor de la casa, muertas.
¿Qué pasó en su aldea?
Pero ya en nuestra aldea se quemaron todas las casas, maíz, frijol, trigo, todo, y quemaron ropa.
¿Y cuántos murieron en su aldea?
allá en nuestra aldea casi se murió 15. 15 en nuestra aldea. Sí.
¿El mismo día?
Sí.
Bueno, definitivamente el comunismo lo que persigue son sus intereses aún a costa de cualquier otra cosa, ¿no? Entonces ellos utilizan artimañas o técnicas aprovechando las ideologías de los pueblos para poder conseguir sus propósitos. Por ejemplo, digamos aquí el pueblo es eminentemente religioso, ellos tratan de infiltrarse a través de la religión para poder conseguir sus propósitos. Si el pueblo tuviera, digamos, a través de ¿qué le podría decir yo? Digamos, en fin, a través de la religión, a través de problemas sociales, ya que definitivamente si hay un porcentaje de pobreza, pues dicen, nos metemos a través de la pobreza para poder conseguir nuestros propósitos.
¿Y los derechos humanos?
Los derechos humanos definitivamente es una política que favorece únicamente a los países del bloque socialista.
En su opinión, ¿dónde nació la política de derechos humanos?
Bueno, los derechos humanos, como política, como dijo el teniente, es usada por el bloque comunista porque van tratando de ver la manera de cómo infiltrarse. Ahora, los derechos humanos, como guatemaltecos que somos nosotros, como gentes y como nuestros hermanos paisanos que son las demás personas que han militado grupos subversivos, los derechos humanos en Guatemala se han respetado, pero la difamación de que hemos sido objeto en el exterior ha sido seguramente más que una continuación del comunismo internacional.
Afortunadamente nosotros internacionalmente la imagen que me dan a mí, yo que soy un soldado guatemalteco, que soy típicamente de estos lugares, la imagen que me dan es que soy un asesino. Pero en realidad Guatemala no ha caído porque la base social principal, que es el pueblo, está con nosotros. Entonces creo que Guatemala todo el tiempo sí se mantendrá libre, aunque para el exterior, aunque para los periodistas extranjeros, nosotros seamos unos asesinos, que es completamente falso.
¿Qué es la importancia de la ayuda de los Estados Unidos en su lucha?
La importancia de los Estados Unidos en la lucha que se está llevando a cabo es definitiva, podría decir. Es definitiva porque si tú ves por aquí en estas regiones se necesitan helicópteros y necesitaríamos otras armas, ¿no?
¿Qué responde usted a las denuncias que dice que el ejército está torturando gente?
Bueno, definitivamente es el comunismo internacional nos acusa a nosotros de esas cuestiones únicamente para desprestigiarnos. Porque yo, que soy un soldado, típicamente que en mis venas corre sangre guatemalteca, no tengo ni el suficiente corazón como para poderle meter el cuchillo a un hermano guatemalteco. Claro que sí tengo el suficiente coraje como para en combate poder pelear contra un enemigo, que es el comunismo internacional, y con ganas lo mato, ¿ya? Pero en combate en el cual él me está tirando. Pero yo, mis principios morales, mis principios éticos, como soldado, como cristiano, no van en el cual yo te pueda degollar o te pueda meter un puñal.
Solo lo trajimos y lo presentamos con el mayor y el mayor le interrogó que dijeran algo, pero no, ni aún no le dijeron nada, ni por la buena ni por la mala, no dicen nada.
El artesano pobre lucha al lado del obrero. El campesino pobre lucha al lado del obrero. La riqueza la producimos los pobres. El ejército agarra a campesinos pobres. Unidos tenemos una fuerza invencible. Toda la familia está en la guerrilla. ¿Qué otra cosa interesante? El ejército guerrillero de los pobres hasta la victoria siempre. Guerra popular. Estas son las diferentes frentes que tienen ellos.
Entonces, aquí están diciendo que el ejército mató a gente.
Exacto.
Sí. A ver, discutir. Sí.
Pero no quieren decirlo
sí, pero
voluntariamente.
Se le saca la verdad.
Ah, sí, sí, sí. ¿Cómo se puede hacer algún guerrillero?
Más o menos pegándole.
Ah, sí.
Para que decir la verdad.
¿Pegándole cómo?
Lastimándole. Más o menos ahorcándolo.
Sí.
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 Hay otros métodos también.
Hay otros métodos.
¿Qué, por ejemplo?
Podemos trocerle la mano.
¿Ah, sí?
Sí.
¿Pero es efectivo? ¿Solo mano?
Las dos.
Ah, las dos.
Sí.
Ajá.
Así es como se han logrado. Y ya también si ya los interrogaron, pues no hay más que les resta matarlo.
Ah, sí.
¿Y cuántos mata?
La mayoría se mató.
Ustedes después del golpe todavía están usando los mismos métodos de interrogación.
Que si estamos utilizando los mismos métodos, sí. Los mismos.
Aquí también, sí.
Aquí también.
Sí.
En todas partes.
Sí, sí. Cuando se entra en una aldea, ¿qué se hace?
Se le pregunta a la gente.
Entonces saca a la gente de las casas.
De las casas. Registrando casas también.
Sí. ¿Y pregunta de qué manera?
Preguntan al comisionado o a alguna otra persona que le informe a uno quiénes son los que hacen cosas fuera de la ley.
Sí. Y cuando se sabe más o menos que todos son colaboradores, ¿qué se hace?
No hay otra cosa que resta.
¿Qué es?
Que matarlo.
¿Y entonces matan a ellos de una vez?
Sí, sí. Si ellos no quieren el bien, ¿qué resta más que bombardear las casas?
¿Bombardear? ¿Con qué?
Bueno, con granadas o alguna otra cosa. O bombas colectivas, armas colectivas.
¿Qué son armas colectivas?
O son bombas de estos gruesos, son cañones que lanzan.
Sí. Pero ¿usan bombas de helicópteros o de aviones?
Sí, de helicópteros.
¿Qué es la cantidad más grande de gente que ustedes han matado de una vez?
Bueno, realmente en Sololá se marchó a cerca de 500 personas.
La verdad es que hay un dicho que hay que es muy real, que la población civil es a la guerrilla lo que el agua es al pez. En este caso, la guerrilla no puede subsistir si no tiene el apoyo y la colaboración de la población.
Actualmente los Estados Unidos están considerando dando ayuda militar aquí en forma de helicópteros. ¿Qué es la importancia del helicóptero para ustedes?
Sí, el helicóptero es un aparato que se ha convertido de gran importancia, no solamente aquí en Guatemala, sino que en otros países en donde han tenido problemas de contrainsurgencia.
Como Vietnam.
En Vietnam, por ejemplo, fue una de los helicópteros, fue un aparato muy utilizado.
¿Y también pueden usarlos en combate?
Claro, sí, el helicóptero, si es un helicóptero ya diseñado propiamente de tipo militar, sí viene artillado para apoyar a unidades terrestres. Vienen artillados con ametralladoras o con lanzacohetes.
¿Y qué tipo de morteros usan ustedes?
Bien, hay varias clases de morteros, pero las que están usando las patrullas pequeñas es el mortero Tampela.
Tampela.
Sí, es un mortero de 60 milímetros.
¿Y es muy poderoso? ¿Tiene mucha fuerza para destrozar?
Sí, es un arma muy efectiva y que se le ha dado muy buen uso y muy buenos resultados en las operaciones de patrullaje.
¿Es arma antipersonal o qué clase?
Es arma contra personal.
¿Tiene una aquí?
El Tampela.
Este es el...
Ajá.
Aparte de eso, que es muy liviano y es fácil de transportar y fácil de operación también.
Entonces es muy ligera y pueden usar con la mano, ¿verdad?
Exacto, sí. Con la mano.
Transporte es en esta forma.
¿Y dónde lo obtienen?
Ese lo estamos obteniendo de Israel. Eso nos están abasteciendo.
Ajá. ¿Y dónde lo obtiene la munición para ellos?
La munición es israelita también.
Ajá.
¿Ellos quisieron salir de Salquil o el ejército les trajo para protegerles?
Agarrados, el ejército los trajo para protegerlos, para que ya no sigan colaborando con los guerrilleros.
Entonces ellos no quisieron salir voluntariamente.
No quisieron salir voluntariamente, se les hizo un llamado por el gobierno, les dio un mes de plazo para que se entregaran. Entonces ya el ejército se encargó de ir a sacar a toda la gente de Salquil, todas esas aldeas.
¿Y cómo reaccionan ellos cuando ustedes llegan para entregarlos? La gente de las aldeas.
Bueno, ellos cuando el ejército llega...
Sí, para entregar ellos.
Se huyen de sus casas.
¿Verdad?
Como ellos huyen entre la montaña, entonces el ejército se obliga a matarlos.
¿Cuál de ellas han ocurrido hechos como este?
Bastantes veces ha ocurrido.
Específicamente, ¿qué son unos ejemplos de aldeas donde ocurrió?
En Salquil, en Sumal chiquito, Sumal grande, Acul.
Which tape you're listening to?
It's the tape from the soldiers in Quiche, the ones that we were talking to up there.
About what they do when they come into a town?
Yeah, they were the ones that we were talking to who were explaining how they'd surround the town when they go out.
Yeah. That's it seems that the strategy seems to be now that they go into all the little villages, kill about a quarter to a third of the people, take the other quarter to a third of the population, round them up in these refugee camps, like we saw, where they then, in order to keep them alive, have to give them food and a little bit of shelter. And then the remainder of the people are just left to wander in the mountains. And like that one sergeant said, if they find any of them, they kill them because they assume that anyone who flees from the army is a guerrilla.
Did you feel afraid at all when we were up there?
not really afraid, more very depressed, being around all the officers who were constantly bombarding you with lies in a very sincere and vigorous way. I mean, it is dangerous here, obviously, but I think because we're American citizens and American journalists, we have a great deal of immunity.
Yeah, I feel pretty funny when we go back to the States sometimes and everybody's saying how brave you are to be in Guatemala and stuff, but if you're an American, and if you're us, I mean, to a certain point, you're protected, and the people who live out there, the peasants are, I mean, they have no protection.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be politically very, very damaging to the government if they did anything to an American journalist. And I mean, because of that, there is some degree of danger. But if you compare our situation to that of just about everyone.
But the other problem of filing a report by phone is that you know that somebody's listening to everything that you say, and if your report is slightly critical, there's a danger that you're going to be followed or
More closely watched.
Or more closely watched, and you know that you're going to be marked from then on. So you have a choice of either saying something which is fairly innocuous, which isn't going to offend the government, or saying something which you might consider to be true. For example, if it's a report about massacres and you consider that the army were responsible for that. If you say directly over the phone, so many people were killed, and according to such and such a report or eyewitness, the army were responsible, its responsibility is directly attributable to the government, then you really wonder what's going to happen when you put the telephone down and walk along the street next time.
Like there have been many months in Guatemala over the past 2 years when the massacres have been at their worst, like 2, 3, 4 month periods, where nothing would come out in the major U.S. media, and in that period maybe 4,000 people had been killed. A series of very bloody, spectacular massacres. And that's just the way, you know, the system happens to function.
Man får lita på nyhetsbyråerna ganska mycket. Och den information som de för ut är oftast hur många dödas på ett ställe utan att ge någon bakgrund till vad det är som egentligen har hänt. För att göra det måste man åka ut. Och det krävs stora resurser till det. Man måste åka ut till platsen. Och det har de flesta tidningar inte råd att hålla sig med en sån service.
Har du en känsla av att de här nyhetsbyråerna som du talar om, de är ofta amerikanska, påverkar det nyhetsförmedlingen?
Jag tror inte att det påverkas så mycket vilken nationalitet det är. Det spelar ingen roll om det är franska, amerikanska eller spanska, för de sitter här i huvudstaden och de har i alla fall ingen möjlighet att ge sig ut, utan de är också hänvisade till den censuren som militären har i sådana här diktaturer. Så även om det vore en svensk nyhetsbyrå som satt här så skulle de ha svårighet att få ut mer information än en amerikansk nyhetsbyrå.
Nu tycks här finnas massakrer i full skala, alltså man dödar en massa indianer och väldigt lite tycks ha kommit ut av det här i den internationella pressen.
Ja.
Vad beror det på?
Jag tror att det beror på att det var många som kom hit under valet som var i början på mars. Och sen har det varit andra saker som varit viktiga under den perioden efteråt, som vad som hänt i Salvador och speciellt kriget om Falklandsöarna. Och sen har folk åkt på semester som jag har gjort till exempel. Så då har man varit beroende av byråerna under den tiden.
tiempo de los fusiles ya pasó. La conquista de las bayonetas ya pasó. La conquista de los dólares ya pasó. Perdón, de los rublos también. Ahora es la conquista del amor. Y aquí estamos precisamente para decirnos hola. Buenas noches. Quería traer a nuestra memoria las expresiones siguientes de Abraham Lincoln. No se puede alcanzar la prosperidad disuadiendo del ahorro. No se puede ayudar al obrero derribando al patrono. No se puede promover la fraternidad humana fomentando el odio de clase. No se puede ayudar a los pobres destruyendo a los ricos.
Acá en la Escuela Peritécnica es el centro de formación de oficiales profesionales del Ejército de Guatemala. Tiene 109 años de funcionar.
Capitán García, ¿qué tipo de sujetos militares son sus áreas que usted enseña aquí?
Bueno, yo puedo ayudarles en mucho de infantería, de cursos de infantería, de fuerzas especiales también, paracaidismo, y muchos sujetos de lo militar, no solamente infantería, mucho de todo, de infantería que permanece en el militar, de muchas cosas.
¿Qué distancia les dije a ustedes que deben de rastrear dentro de los lagos? De 40 a 50 metros, ¿o no se los dije? Van a ir ustedes con su gente y se van a morir.
¿Ustedes han participado en otros tipos de patrullas? ¿O qué son las varias clases de patrulla que practican los cadetes?
Ellos practican patrullas de pie y también de motorizados. Mucho más de pie que de motor. Porque ellos tienen experiencia también andando en el bosque y lo que sea. Ellos pasan mucho tiempo.
Well, I think there'll probably be fair amount of interest in the States and the fact that a Green Beret is teaching combat at the Polytechnica, because since 1977 it's been generally assumed in the States and in Congress and in the press that the U.S. has stopped all military aid to Guatemala, and because Guatemala refused to accept human rights conditions. Yet his role, as he said, is essentially not different from the role the U.S. advisors are playing in El Salvador.
Where is this?
These were taken outside of Guatemala City, and these were in Nebach, in north of Guatemala City.
That are showing the Indian rebels who are dead.
Yeah. Those are four guerrillas they were captured by a civil patrol, and then they were brought in, and they threw off a grenade as a suicide act while they were being held in the army outpost, and they sort of finished off themselves, and
They were captured by the civil patrol or killed by the civil
patrol? They were captured by them, and while they were in here waiting to be interrogated, one of them had a grenade hidden in his boot, and he set it off as a suicide act. And they didn't get killed. The army finished them off. They killed them, later, but
once they were in captivity.
Yeah.
So
this is inside the army base.
Okay. And where exactly in?
It's called Nebach. It's north of Guatemala City. It's 5 hours away.
How far is that from the Mexican border?
It's not near the Mexican border.
Okay, well, still.
And don't say it is either.
Well, what happened was in the last weeks, the newspapers have reported the deaths of thousands of Indians close to the Mexican border. So I think they want to do a tie-in. But I think these pictures are representative of the Army.
You can say that's the kind of thing the Army does when they go in.
Obviously. The close-ups and whatnot are much too graphic for Time magazine, that's for sure, though. So these we have no use, but the overalls are...
Recently, the massacres in Beirut got tremendous international coverage. Yet, on an objective scale, as far as the number of people killed, a few hundred people killed, that happens every week or two in a place like Guatemala. Yet, it rarely gets that kind of attention. Why is that? What are the differences between the
The biggest difference is that the Middle East is the single most covered region on the globe. A week rarely goes by that Newsweek magazine does not have a substantial Middle East story. In fact, I can't remember the last time there was one. And this really gets down to the straight. It's a professional principle of journalism rather than having anything to do with politics. If indeed we could find a massacre of 500 people that happens in or near Guatemala City on Friday, and we hear about it on Saturday, you can be sure it will be very heavily covered. It's the fact that it happened a long time ago, and you've got to go back and see, you have someone come out and say, 3 months ago this thing happened. It lacks the drama that they had in something like the Palestinian massacres in Beirut, where you could go in and there were these damn corpses lying all over the place.
The essential difference is the number of the commitment that a news organization makes to covering a place. Because in Guatemala, if you had the presence of correspondents there, 1/3 of what you had in a place like the Mideast. Guatemala is a very small place.
Yeah, there have been massacres an hour away from
With most of the
Guatemala
massacres,
City.
you could be in that little town within 35 minutes, within 1 hour, and it could have happened the day before, and you could do the same. The difference is the correspondents simply aren't there because an overall news judgment has been made that it's not nearly as important an issue. I'm a freelance reporter and just came back from Guatemala, and I have an interview with an American military man there. Who's doing the same thing that the advisors are doing in El Salvador. And I wanted to find out if you might be interested in running that. Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, what would you what would you want to do then? I'm in New York at the moment. Yes. I was planning to come down there in the next few days. That's good. Okay. Yeah, there are two other things I have also, which are may also be of interest. One is a series of interviews with frontline Guatemalan troops, where they describe in some detail their torture methods and their massacres they participated in, with their names and so on. And the other is similar material on their use of the U.S. helicopters for bombing. Well, partly with my own funds, and also as working with doing a documentary for a European television crew. And it's called Epidem. It's a Finnish outfit. I think you may have, the guy who's working on it mentioned he may have met you in El Salvador. Will you be there tomorrow afternoon? All right. I think I may come down sometime tomorrow morning then. What time starts to be bad for you as far as your being on deadline? 3 and 5. All right. Well, I'll give you a call sometime then. All right. Bye.
And these are the suspected guerrillas who blew themselves up,
Yeah,
or tried to blow themselves up. It is a little graphic. I mean, it's a little bit. It's strong for us, but we've run things like that before. I mean, that's an effective picture.
I wish somebody would use it.
Well, it's really pretty good. And I think what we need. Okay, well, you start out with a picture like that. You start out with a story about. Now, Amnesty International says that this is over the last several months that they've killed. I think it was 2,600, tortured and killed 2,600 people. And obviously, the story you want to do is showing what's going on in Guatemala. That Rios Montt, who's this professes to be a born-again Christian, is in fact commander-in-chief of an army that's absolutely terrorizing and murdering the population. So, I mean, how do you tell that story? Obviously, the army isn't going to let you do it. I think you've got you get a very good sense of what the refugee camps look like. On the other hand, to be a cynical editor, we've seen so many refugee camps in so many places. So that you really want to come in tight, and if your story is the most brutal army in the world, how do you tell that story? And I don't quite see it here.
You want to see something happen?
You want to see a soldier maybe picking through it. Well, you want I mean, that house, there was nothing in it. It was overgrown with weeds, which indicates that it had been a while since anybody had been there. You want a house that's really been freshly invaded. I don't know, kids' shoes lying on the floor, toys, or kitchen utensils to show that somebody was just there, that people lived there.
What is completely missing is placing the attack on the peasantry in Guatemala in the context of long-term American policy towards Guatemala. The consistent American role in maintaining in power the thugs and murderers who are carrying these things out, that's almost never mentioned. And in fact, for example, well, another thing that's never mentioned these days is the Israeli connection. I mean, the Congress has in fact prevented the administration for the last few years from directly aiding and supporting the murderous regime in Guatemala, and they're really about the closest thing to the Nazis that you can find in the contemporary world. They have been prevented by Congress from aiding them directly, so they're doing it indirectly, and they're doing it indirectly through a client state, Israel, which is supplying arms and advisors and so on and so forth. Again, that you may find an occasional reference to that hidden in a story somewhere, but the nature of the system whereby the United States installed, maintained in power, and continues to maintain in power a regime which is, well, almost unmatched, I suppose, in its violence and brutality and sadism. This analysis of the situation is never presented. The media are major corporations. In fact, in terms of, say, employment, the major corporate media are among the major employers in the country, and they are, in fact, central corporations. So their ownership and management naturally reflects corporate interests. Those are the circles from which it comes, and it's not at all surprising that they reflect those interests.
You mean a general corporate way of thinking?
A kind of a mentality which accepts the framework of assumptions of corporate America, which means also the government, because the linkage is so close.
It's one thing for the media to simply follow the state line in a rather passive manner, as you described. But it's something else for them to see themselves as participants in a high-level dialogue with the state, which I think they very much see themselves as.
Yes, but
and certainly accept all the basic assumptions, no question about that. But feeling that they have to be somehow convinced of basic policies, and generally going along, but occasionally dissenting and trying to nudge the state in one direction or the other.
The journalists and the media in general simply reflect the atmosphere of the general intellectual community, the ideological system as a whole, which is, as in every country virtually, is very supportive of state policy.
Because of the alleged human rights violations, the Reagan administration has assured Congress that the United States has no military relationship with Guatemala. But freelance newsman Allan Nairn has discovered the U.S. military is involved in Guatemala. CBS News correspondent Ed Rabel in Washington reports.
They call this man Garcia. He is in Guatemala teaching future officers of the Guatemalan army how to fight guerrillas. Use of weapons, map reading, ambush techniques, Garcia teaches them all. So what, you might ask? This is what. This man they call Garcia is from Arizona. He's an American, a Green Beret in the United States Army, Captain Jesse Garcia.
If an American military officer is in Guatemala teaching people how to ambush and how to engage in military operations, then that is just the direct contradiction of everything that Congress has been told by the Reagan administration.
I can teach them all any American infantry type equipment that I've used. Radios, communication equipment, weapons, any of our weapons, M1s, M14s, M16s, M79s.
That this American is teaching such things to Guatemalans with their record on human rights makes some congressmen on the House Foreign Affairs Committee angry. What makes them more angry, they say, is that the administration seems to have violated an informal agreement granting the congressman what amounts to a veto over any United States military assistance to Guatemala. The Army says Captain Garcia is in Guatemala as part of an officer exchange program.
This is not a hidden program. We've been doing it for about 40 years, for the last 6 in Guatemala. We have an exchange instructor. He is teaching students in an academic environment. The Army holds that that's not an advisory effort, and we're not trying in any way, shape, or form to circumvent congressional understandings.
The administration has on, I don't know how many occasions, I mean, just constantly assured the Congress over the last 2 years that we are not engaged in a military relationship with Guatemala, that we're not providing training for the Guatemalan military, that we, I mean, it could not be any more clear.
In addition to the Garcia case, the congressmen are worried about the proposed sale of $3 million worth of spare parts to Guatemala for its military helicopters. Just last week, the congressman got word that the State Department may okay the sale without congressional approval.
I think if the administration goes forward with the proposal to sell military equipment to the government of Guatemala, without the approval of those of us in Congress who entered into this agreement with them, it'll be a very direct breach of faith with the Congress.
A State Department official says the matter is being discussed with Congress, but would not say whether a congressional stamp of approval is needed to sell the spare parts to Guatemala. Ed Rabel, CBS News, Washington.